While the Biden administration publicly aims to avoid conflict with Iran, escalating rhetoric from American officials threatens to fuel tensions in an already volatile region. As violence in Gaza threatens to engulf more parties, any war between the US and Iran would likely have disastrous consequences despite surface-level confidence in Washington. With risks of a broader regional war mounting amid ongoing clashes, de-escalation of language becomes ever more important to prevent crisis from giving way to open warfare between adversaries. For example, on November 26, Senator Tom Cotton advocated for the Biden administration to respond with massive retaliation against Iran to stop attacks on U.S. assets. Overall, members of Congress, the Biden administration, and former defense officials have expressed views indicating Washington could escalate towards armed conflict due to Iranian aggression. However, most experts agree that despite hawkish rhetoric, a war between the US and Iran would have disastrous consequences for all involved. Escalating tensions through inflammatory language heightens risks of miscalculation and moves the region further from peace. While Iranian actions deserve scrutiny, prudent policymaking requires calibrated diplomacy and de-escalation over disproportionate threats of force that could destabilize the Middle East, regardless of the stated goal, whether destroying Iran's nuclear program or regime change. There are only two options for the US to directly attack Iran militarily. One is an air and naval campaign intended to inflict substantial costs on the Iranian regime. The other is a ground invasion requiring air and naval supremacy first. However, both options face greater challenges than acknowledged and underestimate Iran's military capabilities. A strategy relying on air and naval forces to quickly compel Iran's submission through force would likely meet significant resistance. Iran's military architecture is designed to deter invasion and repay attacks from the air or sea at a high cost. Iran has cruise missiles with 600-mile range, advanced long-range air defense systems, short-range systems, anti-aircraft missiles, over 3,000 ballistic missiles, around 6,000 naval mines, and some of the most sophisticated unmanned aerial vehicles in the region. Due to these strengths, a U.S. campaign solely using air and sea power would be more difficult than suggested and carry high risks of unintended escalation. In short, any military action primarily utilizing air and naval capabilities would not only confront the customary obstacles that render such campaigns rarely effective, but attempting strikes within Iranian borders would likely incur steep costs in terms of valuable U.S. aircraft and ballistic missile defense platforms destroyed. Previous analyses have assessed the prospects of success for a strategy heavily reliant on American air and naval forces. A notable 2002 wargame simulation had to have its rules altered mid-play, as Iran swiftly sank U.S. vessels. Pentagon officials estimated in 2012 that such an air-sea approach would demand no less than 100,000 ground troops to have a chance of achieving objectives. These examinations indicate the venture could easily escalate beyond expectations in control, failing to yield decisive results while absorbing heavy casualties and losses of sophisticated weaponry. A large-scale ground deployment thus seems unavoidable under such a model. In light of heightened tensions between the U.S. and Iran in 2019, Pentagon analysts assessed that a variant of this air-sea approach aimed at demolishing Tehran's nuclear sites would necessitate no fewer than 120,000 troops stationed across the Middle East region. In the current circumstances, an absence of any new appraisals, and even larger conventional military deployment may prove needed, considering Iran's amplified defense expenditures in the interim. Consequently, relying predominantly on air and naval forces promises little chance for the U.S. to overcome Iran's strengthened military posture through standoff means alone. Any operations against Iranian targets of consequence appear all but certain to require a substantial conventional ground involvement as well. From the outset, economic global oil prices would likely surge due to disruptions in supply from the Middle East. Both nations' economies would suffer, with Iran potentially facing crippling sanctions. Humanitarian war would cause immense civilian suffering in Iran, with potential displacement, food shortages, and infrastructure damage. The region could face wider instability and refugee crises. Regional and global repercussions. The escalation of the conflict could trigger wider proxy wars in the region, involving other countries with vested interests. Tensions between major powers like the US and Russia could escalate. Nuclear proliferation. The possibility of Iran using its nuclear program for military purposes could heighten, potentially prompting other regional actors to pursue nuclear weapons. Energy security. Disruptions in oil and gas supplies from the Middle East could have significant consequences for global energy markets, impacting prices and economic stability worldwide. Long-term implications. Political instability. The war could destabilize governments in the region, potentially leading to regime change or increased radicalization. The global political landscape could be reshaped. Economic fallout. The long-term economic costs of the war would be immense, impacting both nations' development and potentially triggering a global recession. Social and cultural scars. The war would leave lasting social and cultural scars on both societies, potentially fueling animosity and hindering future reconciliation efforts. If the goal is to leverage air and naval power to enable ground operations, Iran is also prepared for that scenario. Such an assault would require immense costs to gain a foothold inside the country. Analysts estimate over 1.6 million US troops would be needed for a full-scale ground invasion, nearly 10 times the largest contingent ever committed to Iraq. Once engaged on Iranian soil, the US would face tremendous human and material resources. Iran has the 13th largest population fit for military service globally, and stockpiles the 13th most armored vehicles, 9th most towed artillery, and 8th most multiple rocket launchers worldwide. Casualties and losses would be enormous on both sides. Tehran's strategy would center on making any naval or air assault painfully slow and prohibitive, betting that Americans will lose resolve to continue a drawn-out war. With 2,400 kilometers of coastline, Iran is poised to utilize anti-ship and air defense missiles, as well as their advantage over the dearth of US minesweepers, to drag out the fighting. This aims to undermine domestic political support in the US and allow time for Tehran to weigh responses or blockade the Strait of Hormuz. Hoping for an easy victory over Iran is as unrealistic as expecting humans to sprout wings. The means simply do not exist for this to be a short or low-cost conflict. Thus, mutual deterrence preventing escalation remains the soundest strategy for all parties. It's important to remember that these are just potential consequences, and the actual course of events would depend on various factors, including the duration and intensity of the conflict, the tactics used, and the international response. Instead of focusing on the negatives, it's important to emphasize the importance of peaceful resolutions to international conflicts. Diplomacy, dialogue, and international cooperation are crucial in preventing such conflicts and finding solutions that address the underlying issues.